Hello, my name is Scott Davison. I am the Dean of the Caudill College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Morehead State University. Today's Caudill Conversation is about critical race theory and pending legislation in Kentucky. And I have two guests. I have Professor Joe Dunman from the Legal Studies program here at Morehead State University, and Sara Peyton, who teaches social studies in the Rowan County School District. Thank you both for joining me today. The legislation pending in Kentucky is similar to legislation in some other states. We think it's helpful to look at this both from a legal perspective and also from the point of view of someone who is actually teaching in the classroom. So today we're going to begin with Joe, who's going to talk a little bit about the pending legislation, some of the legal challenges that surrounds the way that it's been framed, and some of the history of the questions that are at stake. So I'll let you take over from here, Joe.
Thanks, Scott. So, like many other Republican-controlled state legislatures around the country, this year the Kentucky General Assembly is considering several bills designed to limit what teachers can discuss in the classroom. These bills are generally referred to as anti-CRT bills, where CRT means critical race theory, an academic approach that was developed by law professors, primarily taught only in third-year law school elective courses. Now, the crux of CRT is that white supremacy throughout American history has been expressed and enforced through laws that often appear to be neutral in their language or operation. For example, one method used to prevent freed slaves from voting in the South after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, was known as the Grandfather Clause. It worked like this. In order to vote, everyone, white, black, everybody, first had to prove that they were literate. To prove literacy, voters had to take an elaborate or often impossible test to pass. Southern leaders couldn't outright ban black people from voting after the 15th Amendment was ratified, so they concocted these literacy tests to neutrally do the work for them. Literacy requirements excluded many black people simply by default. They were never taught to read as slaves, and learning later in life was very difficult. But even if they could read, the impossible literacy test would just stop them. The literacy tests were also impossible for white people, too. So white Southern legislators came up with an ostensibly neutral way around it. A voter did not have to take a literacy test if they were a descendant of someone who could vote legally before 1866. So why 1866, right? That's an arbitrary date to pick. Well, not really. Obviously, no black person in the South had such an ancestor because before 1866, they were all slaves. Critical race theory focuses on the fact that even though the literacy tests and the grandfather clause were neutral on their face, I mean, after all, everybody has a grandfather, right? And the clause didn't explicitly require a white grandfather, just any grandfather who could vote back then. They still purposely enforced white supremacy and excluded black people from voting despite the 15th Amendment. So, all that's to say, CRT is just an academic method of analyzing these types of government actions. These types of government actions may be neutral on their face, but they have a disparate racial impact. And it's an academic method generally reserved for law school and graduate programs, mostly because it deals with complicated subject matter and a lot of deep history that you just don't have time to cover or the will to cover in K through 12. But it's important stuff, and so it is, with maybe a couple exceptions, not taught in any K through 12 school in the country. Nevertheless, Republican activists have seized on CRT as the latest culture war bogeyman, and GOP legislators have introduced bills that purposely ban it. Kind of. So here in Kentucky, we currently have three bills: House Bills 14 and 18, and a Senate bill called 138. So aside from the fact that CRT is not actually taught in Kentucky public schools, the key legal problem with these bills is that they don't actually ban critical race theory. In fact, it's difficult to determine exactly what they do ban or what kind of curriculum they're designed to stop. So House Bills 14 and 18 are both very similar. They both include an identical list of banned concepts, such as the teaching that one race is inherently superior to another, or, quote, an individual by virtue of his race is inherently racist or oppressive, close quote, or, quote, the United States is fundamentally or irredeemably racist, close quote. So under House Bill 14, a school district must pay $5,000 a day if a teacher is determined to be promoting a concept like this. And then under House Bill 18, the teacher themselves will be subject to discipline up to including termination and revocation of their teaching license. So they're punitive bills. They're bills that specifically prohibit certain types of behavior and seek to criminalize it, or not necessarily criminalize, but punish it. And so There are three key problems from these kinds of bills. First, they prohibit actions and concepts that are already banned by the Kentucky Civil Rights Act and federal laws that prohibit discrimination based on race and sex, like Title IX. Teachers and all government actors are already prohibited from singling out students or anyone else based on these protected classifications. Teachers are already not allowed to tell students, you're bad because you're white or you're bad because you're black, even though that may still happen. That's not something that's currently legal. Second, the laws would prohibit actions and concepts that aren't actually being promoted in public schools, certainly not by any advocates of critical race theory. None of the bill sponsors or the proponents of such laws ever cite any real-life examples of teachers telling students they're inherently inferior because of their race, certainly not in the name of CRT, right? So critical race theory is not a moral imposition or a method of making students feel bad. It's an approach to analyzing neutral laws and how they have disparate impacts. Ironically, the kind of behavior that these bills would ban is precisely the kind of behavior that CRT was developed to identify and eliminate, not promote. Third, and most importantly in my mind, the laws are just really vague, unconstitutionally so. Under both the First Amendment and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, courts can strike down laws for being too vague. And what I mean by vague is that they impose penalties for behavior in an unclear way. Laws are supposed to be clear enough that everyone here has fair notice of what they can and cannot do. The House bills prohibit promotion of certain banned concepts, but don't specifically define what that means. If a teacher notes the existence of white supremacy and attempts to explain its ideological tenets, are they promoting the inherent superiority of one race over another? The bills don't say. They don't tell us exactly what promotion means or how a teacher would go about promoting something. It doesn't say that mere mention is promotion, but it also doesn't say that it's not. If a teacher discusses the history of American racism and their students find it uncomfortable, has a teacher promoted the concept that, quote, any individual should feel discomfort on account of his or her race, close quote? That's something that's also prohibited by the bill. The bills don't say. They don't say exactly what kind of speech would rise to the level. And teachers can't control the discomfort of their students, right? I'm sure I say things in class that make students uncomfortable. Maybe they don't like the fact that there's racism in our history. I can't control that. And it's not, but I don't know what makes them uncomfortable, and I can't constantly pull the class. This is a big problem for educators, right? They'll be constantly guessing whether or not something they're saying would run afoul of these laws. This creates what the Supreme Court has long called a chilling effect on free speech. You effectively censor yourself out of fear of an uncertain penalty. This kind of chilling effect has long been held unconstitutional. Even though the state legislature has great power to dictate the curriculum of its public schools, and that may be standards, I'm not exactly sure, but they have great power over schools. Its teachers do not check the First Amendment and due process rights at the door. They have a right to speak without fear of punishment on unclear grounds. Now, I'll finish with Senate Bill 138. It's the third CRT bill, but it's a little different from these. It's not punitive. The original version was a word-for-word copy of a bill already introduced in Virginia. Instead of listing prohibited concepts, the original version of 138 listed things that schools must teach. Among these are things most of us already take for granted, such as the fact that all individuals are created equal, or all individuals are, quote, entitled to equal protection. Well, that's explicitly required by the 14th Amendment, so it's not very controversial. The original version of Bill 138 provided a list of historical documents that shall be taught in Kentucky schools, including things like the Mayflower Compact, or the Constitution, or the writings of Madison and Hamilton, or the even works by Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. Most students are already exposed to this stuff in K through 12 already. The original version of 138 went even further, though, requiring schools to take specific policy positions. For example, schools were required to teach that slavery and Jim Crow were contrary to fundamental American promises, even though slavery appears 3 times in the original Constitution, and that defining racial disparities solely on the legacy of slavery is, quote, destructive to the unification of our nation. Well, most of us would probably agree, but defining racial disparities solely on the legacy of slavery, I'm not sure how far that goes or if people are even doing that. The original version also said nothing in the law should restrict schools from, quote, impartial discussions about controversial aspects of history or the oppression of particular groups. But the original law didn't define, quote unquote, impartial discussions, leaving a giant gray area again for teachers trying to comply with the law. Luckily, after some lobbying by the Kentucky School Board Association, that language was removed, and the current version simply prohibits schools from requiring employees from stereotyping any group, which of course is already prohibited by the Kentucky Civil Rights Act and bad practice in general. Now, despite the changes to SB 138, all three bills still target behavior and problems that, illustrated by the sponsor's lack of concrete examples, don't actually exist in Kentucky public schools. It's hard not to see these as anything other than grist for the culture war mill, designed to motivate Republican donors and voters to stay mad and stay engaged as the midterm elections near. And it's critical. It has critical save the children angle that has so long been compelling in American politics, right? Think of the poor children and what they're subjected to in schools, even though there's none that I'm aware of, no real life examples of children being taught that they're innately inferior due to their race, at least certainly not from a critical race theory perspective, which would counsel the opposite. If these laws pass, especially the House bills, I would expect legal challenges almost immediately. And despite the current conservative supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court, it's hard to square these bills with longstanding constitutional law doctrine on due process and free speech.
Thank you, Joe. It's very helpful to hear a legal perspective on this legislation. It sounds like what you're saying very roughly is that they're targeting something that's not taught in the schools typically, and that something that we shouldn't object to being taught in the schools, but what they are targeting is already banned and something that we would all accept anyway. So that's kind of a puzzle, almost like their legislation in search of a problem that doesn't really exist. Sara, you're someone who's dealing with these questions on a daily basis in terms of what to teach students and about American history. Why don't you share some of your thoughts with us about what the legislation suggests to you and where, how this would go as a teacher trying to navigate these difficult things?
So, from my point of view, there are a couple of driving forces behind the anti-critical race theory movement, which, by the way, as a history teacher, I hadn't even heard that term until 2 years ago or a year and a half ago when it became, the political lightning rod that it is now. That aside, the reason for it is that supporters, on the one hand, want teachers to focus on what they call a patriotic education. And then a second is that proponents don't want children, and when they say children, they mean white children specifically, to quote, feel bad or to be made to feel guilty for the past. The very first lesson I do with my kids each year is about empathy. All right. As a history teacher, as an historian, a primary purpose of the study of history is to put yourself in someone else's shoes, look at the world from their perspective, understand their experience. And I want my students to be made to feel. And when you study history and you're looking at stories, that's the whole point, is like getting them to think about something from someone who lived it and experienced it. I want them to be able to. So I saw a middle school teacher actually made a list of every single concept he would not be able to teach in his 8th grade curriculum if he avoided, as one of the House bills said, issues of race, gender, or religion. And I haven't gone and extensively done that. But I was thinking, if I couldn't talk about race, religion, and gender, when I'm teaching students, I wouldn't be able to ask them to feel, what it would feel like to be a soldier who was awaiting orders to invade mainland Japan in 1945, or to put themselves in the position of a white Northern college student who had a noose tied around her neck and was dragged behind a car because she was in Mississippi in 1964 registering blacks to vote. Couldn't ask them to think about what it would be like to be an American housewife in the 50s who had worked in a factory in World War II and then had been fired and was expected to go home and have babies. Couldn't ask them to think about what it would be like to be a Japanese American who was interned in 1942 solely for his race. To be a Muslim American in the days after 9/11, to be a soldier in Vietnam trying to discern whether Vietnamese village was friend or foe. All of those are significant stories that students should learn about. All of them bring us to a greater understanding of history and humanity, and all of them involve issues of race, gender, and religion. And the fear is, could those things not be taught? And what a disservice we are doing to students if we do not teach them what it means to be empathetic and to understand history from other people's points of view. In my mind, if we raise a generation without that skill, our nation is going to be in serious uh, problem. And then, the other motivation or aspect of this motivation behind these bills is that they're not addressing how children of color are made to feel. How do they feel if they don't see themselves represented in the stories we teach in our curriculum? It's simply assumed we are considering white children's feelings. And that's ignorant, and tragic to a whole population of students. As Joe was talking about, like a concern is who gets to determine what these designated concepts are. With the vague wording, it does leave a great gray area for teachers to know what can and cannot be talked about. When I teach World War II, we study fascism, and the students examine the defining characteristics of these regimes. One of them is the dictation of educational curriculum. I mean, in Nazi Germany, teachers were dismissed after student informers tattled on any instruction that didn't fall into the mandated character building narrative. Some of these proposed bills, not only in Kentucky, but in other states, encourage this behavior for parents or students to report when their teachers teach something that they find objectionable. In New Hampshire, there's a conservative group that's given like a $500 bounty to parents that turn in these types of stories. It seems ludicrous to say this, but are the Nazis really what we want to model ourselves after? To return to the idea of teaching a patriotic education, it's the fascist totalitarian regimes that teach patriotic education. You're talking the Soviet Union and China and North Korea. Free and democratic states don't indoctrinate their students with patriotism. In the great irony in this Senate Bill 138, it actually says we're supposed to teach an unbiased history, yet says we must teach patriotism. And I don't understand the disconnect there. How do they not understand that that is a form of indoctrination? There's a confusion as to, or hypocrisy really, the idea that we want to indoctrinate students to think a certain way, not have a student population that learns to think critically and to be active, socially conscious citizens. When I was thinking about this a few weeks ago, my students were learning about the March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington, D.C. and the leaders who organized it. And I included the story of Bayard Rustin, who was a Black, openly gay man who was nearly removed from planning of the march because of people's objection to his homosexuality. And ultimately, it was Dr. King who supported his continued leadership. But when I finished that story, one of my students commented, "Man, I hate that I've never heard of this guy before." And why should that story be banned? Why would we try to erase people and groups and ideas and events from our collective story? The answer is it's just about manipulating voters, I think. And like Joe was saying, to scare people into believing that we are somehow crafting, this evil narrative to our children to hate America. And that is so not what we do. I think I can speak on behalf of most teachers and say, we don't ask our students to feel guilty for the past. We don't teach our students that they're responsible for the mistakes and atrocities of previous generations. But we do teach them that they're responsible for the future, for making sure such things don't happen again. I don't want them to, and I don't ask them to feel guilt, but I do ask them to feel. And that's the purpose of history and of education, in my point of view. And one other quick story. When we were wrapping up the civil rights unit, I overheard a discussion between two students, and this one girl says, if we would just stop talking about racism, it would go away. And another student chimed in and said, kids learn what they're brought up in. And if all they know from their families is racism, then we have to talk about it so students can learn a different belief. And I didn't even have to intervene in this conversation. I just kind of listened to them, and they got it. In fact, the other girl kind of clarified. She's like, no, I mean, if parents would stop teaching their kids racist stuff, we wouldn't have to talk about it anymore, which, yes, in a perfect world would be nice. But it just reinforced to me how essential it is that we have these conversations, that students have a place to talk with each other, to talk with their teachers, and to be exposed to ideas, of things that they have maybe not been brought up in. That's not a bad thing. To me, that is education at its best.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really helpful to understand what this must be like as a teacher, thinking about this legislation possibly pending and how it would affect the way you do your job every day. And it's interesting to think about the point of education, not just to impart facts, but also to help people to understand each other and get along. And we have this idea of liberty and justice for all, not just the people who are like me, but other people too. And if they have different histories in our country, we need to understand and respect that. Both of you mentioned sort of political impulses at work here, sort of driving the legislation, trying to create reasons for people to vote in a certain way. Do you think that there's going to be a lasting impact here from just the proposal of this legislation for people who are working in your area? Do you think that this is going to have a chilling effect? Will teachers always now be second guessing themselves in ways they never were?
I'll speak briefly to it just then that I know hearing from other teachers and even seeing what teachers around the nation post on Twitter and social media, there is absolutely a chilling effect that has already started. You know, this fear of not being able to talk about certain things. And, you know, there was a school that put out a letter, I don't remember what state it was, but if the parents wanted to exempt their children from lessons of Black history for the month of February, they could send in, you know, and it's just Black history, women's history, Native history. It's all history. It's all our story. There's no dividing it up. It's all interconnected. And to make teachers fearful of being truthful with their students, I mean, you know, students feel betrayed sometimes. Like when we talk about Rosa Parks, you know, I tell them, you know, she wasn't tired that day. It wasn't just all of a sudden she had it. You know, this was intentional. She was working with the NAACP, and kids are like, well, we were told that she was just tired and had it. You know, they want to know the truth, I believe. So I think it is definitely a scary, chilling effect that is there.
I have to say, you know, as a parent and someone who serves on the local school board, I appreciate the professional credentials you bring to the classroom. It's not as if there's a single book that is the history of the United States that you just look up the answer and tell the story. You know, it requires interpretation. It's always changing. We learn more things all the time, and it's your responsibility to try to convey that to the students in a way that engages them and also informs them and also conveys these important things we're talking about, like empathy. It's a very complicated job. I appreciate your devotion to it. Joe, in terms of legislation, what would be sort of a push in the opposite direction? What would legislation look like? Would it be designed to protect teachers or give them more autonomy? What would it look like if people were pushing on the other side of this? How would that go?
I would not call myself a policy master or anything, but well, I mean, we already have right. We already have lots of protections for teachers in the First Amendment, the Due Process Clause, right? Protections that limit government power to dictate. Now, government's in a tricky position with public schools because public schools are government entities and they create curriculum for them, and so the government is speaking through them. Um, and teachers are government agents, who are employees of the government, and so they don't have full reign, right? We don't here in post-secondary, we enjoy a lot more freedom than K through 12 teachers, but they still are, human beings with an interest in saying what they want to say and being professionals, right? And following their professional judgment, right? I mean, a contrary bill would say, we whatever curriculum we try to create, we try to maximize the educational freedom, right? Like academic freedom. We hold teachers to, we want highly trained teachers to be able to express themselves and bring different perspectives to the classroom. And so ideal legislation would be none, right? Fewer restrictions on what teachers can do. The law should be silent as to what they can say or what decisions they can make. Again, schools are free to create curriculum and standards, and that's important. But those standards and curriculum should be geared towards maximizing the amount of discretion that well-trained teachers can bring. I mean, I know a teacher fearful of every word they say is not going to help me learn anything. And a teacher who has the confidence that they can say and get away with, quote unquote, saying a lot of different things is going to be a teacher who brings more ideas and makes me think harder. Right. And I tell my students all the time, I teach a seminar on the history of American law right now. And I told them at the very beginning, look, I'm going to take positions in this class, right? I want you to argue with me when it's appropriate, but also know that your grade doesn't depend on you agreeing with me, right? You can disagree on everything, but let's talk about these things and recognize what actually occurred. And if you want to take a different perspective, you're free to do that. And any legislative response would be to try to maximize that kind of situation. If any, mostly, right? Don't propose these bills. We already have laws that prohibit the kind of behavior that they ostensibly are geared to prevent. And the culture war stuff just doesn't belong. Usually, right? It's Sara mentioned exempt from lessons, right? Opting out of certain lessons. And the real goal is the same it's always been, is that we want to create a system, we want to privatize public education, get parents to opt out of public schools entirely because they think they're a threat to their children, and then funnel public money into private charter schools and whatnot. I mean, that's always been the goal. And it just convinces parents that schools are just, run by Satan or some racist or something. You can't trust them. And so, why don't you give your tax dollars to me, who conveniently created this charter school, and I get to buy a new yacht.
So if you're right that this legislation is designed to kind of sort of create anger and mistrust in the service of voting in a certain way, would you predict in the future that this will occur again? There was recent legislation, a big fuss about teaching religion in the public schools. Now it's critical race theory. Nobody had heard of critical race theory, I think, and so this was exploiting a loophole in public knowledge, you might say. Would you predict this will happen again, that there'll be another set of topics that we are suspicious about what's happening in the public schools, and another reason for grave concern? If this works in the midterm elections, should we expect this sort of cycle to repeat itself? Is that what you would predict?
Well, I'm not super old, but I've been around long enough to see this happen before, right? I'm old enough to remember when all public school teachers were Satanist cult members, right? I mean, we've had satanic panics in the 80s and the 90s. We've had various different, bogeymen appear here and there, right? Of course, it'll continue. And the great thing about critical race theory as something to anchor this on is that nobody knows what critical race theory is because nobody teaches it, right? And so it was a perfect target. It sounds complicated, right? Critical race theory. We've got race in it, which is the first, big problem there. But it's easy to just dump a bunch of ideas on top of this this label because nobody actually knows what it is. And so, right, if this doesn't work or if it does, whatever, the next thing will be the next theory. I can't predict, and I don't want to give anybody any ideas. But right, I mean, surely they'll find something else to find until the end goal is reached, right? Which is tax dollars going to private schools, and parents who are uncomfortable with diversity can put their children in a school that protects them from that, and tax dollars flow to the pockets of whoever owns it, and then that's the system, right? The fully privatized system that they crave. So yeah, I mean, this will keep happening over and over. It's a cycle. It always is. If it's not a migrant caravan this cycle, it'll be CRT the next cycle. It just, right, it's whatever gets people motivated towards eventually achieving the policy goals of the folks who promote it.
Well, the public schools remain the only option for many people in most places. And so I think it's important for us to have this conversation and identify the pressures that public schools face, and to try to pull for those institutions, because there's no system of private schools ready to take their place, certainly. And I don't know if that's even part of the vision here, but and if you think about how democracy is supposed to work, you need a well-educated citizenry to do the job of being a good citizen. So we hope our public schools are able to do what they're designed to do and what they're charged with doing. But it's hard when the legislature is trying to mess with the process of well-trained persons here. So I think that draws us sort of to the close of our time here together. I want to thank you again, Joe and Sara, for joining me for this conversation. It's been very illuminating and helpful. I thank you both for sharing your perspective and your expertise today.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome, Scott.
We look forward to the next edition of the Caudill Conversations. That was great. Thanks, guys. We kind of went off on the political sideline there for a little bit, but I think, you know, if people don't understand that that's what's going on, I think that's pretty helpful. I had somebody on the school board come up to me and say, "What do you think about critical race theory? It's so divisive. It's dividing our country." This was about 8 months ago, and I was like, "What?" Yeah, they just don't. It's just from Fox News. It's like, here's this new thing, and it's terrible. You know, it's just terrible. And, it
Yeah.
really worked. It really worked.
Ask them to define. Well, can you tell me what critical race theory is? And no, they can't.
I know that's happened on the debate too, on several state legislatures. People have paused and said, "Now, what exactly are you posing here? Can you define that?" Well, no, I know when I see it though.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's cultural Marxism, also something they can't define. So,
Yeah, it's ironic. I hope that this is not like a winning strategy, but it seems to be winning.
Yeah. One in Virginia. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I think it was really part of the governor's race there. Yeah.
yeah.
well, I mean, combined with gerrymandering and all the same stuff CRT identified in our history, right?
Yeah.
You know, we're slouching back into segregation and Jim Crow, and this is, one method. Also, right, in response to Brown versus Board, Virginia and other states created private schools to allow white parents to pull their kids out of public schools and avoid, any kind of exposure to other human beings. And so, I mean, that's the same. They've always been. They're still mad about Brown versus Board, and they always will be. And I tell my students, right, you gotta think like a white supremacist to understand this stuff, right? Some of the students they already are there, but others they've never thought about it that way before. It's like, if you're a white supremacist, every single day you're sharing a classroom with a black student, you're mad about it, right? You're mad, and they'll always stay mad. And so, yeah, it's difficult and scary, right? Because they have a lot of control in every other way too.
I haven't seen any teachers who have said, "Look, here's what critical race theory is, and I am teaching it, and here's why it's a good thing, and here's why you shouldn't be afraid." That would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
Well,
Yeah, there, Joe's one.
I am doing that.
well, and I was, when you were talking about the grandfather clause, I mean, I teach my students that. I mean, these high schoolers know the purpose of the grandfather clause. They know
Right,
they know
right.
about redlining. They know about the GI Bill. So it's like, do I call
Yeah,
it critical race theory?
right.
But no.
But
So
it's just, in some ways, it's just history, right? I mean, it's in some ways, it's not even, not even a Marxist framework that you need to see.
Right.
It's more like, it's just, this is what happened. You don't have to call it critical race theory. It's just history.
Right. Well, and pointing to the actual motivations, right? What was the point of the grandfather clause? To exclude black people from voting. That was the whole point of it, right? And so,
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're really a critical race theorist, you have to be trying to put yourself in a niche, that separates you from everybody else. You're really getting out there in a way that, that nobody's going to be doing that in public school. Like, that's just, you got to distinguish yourself from other theorists at that point. That's not really what we're up to here.
right.
but it's just sad because it becomes anything that is about race. So the
Yeah.
fact that Black History Month somehow becomes CRT,
Yeah.
Chris, and it's such a uneducated population that this is appealing to and that's buying into it. And it's like I think about my students and I know a lot of their parents, but the